Hello, everyone, and welcome to our latest virtual book launch event. My name is Mark Abizaid. I'm a member of the Othering and Belonging Institute, and I'll be giving a really brief introduction to this event. We're here, of course, to mark the launch of a brand new book, which just came out today by our Assistant Director, Stephen Menendian, called Structural Racism, The Dynamics of Opportunity and Race in America. We'll have Stephen on in a few minutes to introduce the book, and he'll be in conversation with our director, John A. Powell, and Michael Omi, who is Professor Emeritus of Ethnic Studies at UC Berkeley. He's also the co-author with Howard Winant of Racial Formation in the United States. The event will last about 90 minutes. At some point towards the end, we will be answering some of your questions, so drop those in the chat box for us. We'll also be dropping some links in the chat box to different resources we have, including a link to purchase the book and a 25% discount code that we just got created to purchase the book from the publisher. So let me bring on Michael, who's going to be framing the discussion and getting us started. So Michael, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks, Mark. And thank you all for joining us this morning. We certainly do live in interesting times. It was just 5 years ago we witnessed this dramatic social upsurge in response to the murder of George Floyd. The mass national, indeed global mobilization created a broader dialogue about policing, mass incarceration, and the enduring effects of slavery, Jim Crow segregation, and contemporary expressions of racial discrimination. Coupled with the glaring social disparities that were evident at the outset of the COVID-19 pandemic, these issues had a profound effect on the popular discourse about race, how we talked about race and racism. Folks, even corporations, began talking about systemic and structural racism. And while the term structural racism was evoked, its precise meaning and conceptual underpinnings often remain very sketchy and ill-defined. What is a structural understanding of racism, and why does it particularly matter in these troubling political times? In his new book, Stephen Menendian offers us a clear and accessible account of how to understand structural racism and its enduring and intractable character. Stephen does so by challenging some of the existing understandings of racial inequality and provides a sort of illustrative examples of how structural racism works across a broad range of social sites, institutions, policies, and activities. As Mark noted, Stephen Menendian is Assistant Director and Director of Research at the Othering and Belonging Institute here at UC Berkeley. I've known Stephen for many years and consider him a true example of a multitasker who's always involved in several ongoing research and policy initiatives. So welcome, Stephen.
Thank you, Michael. It's such a joy to be with you this morning.
Thanks. Stephen, why don't we start off? And I'm sure as we discuss things will get much more, we'll deal with things much more in depth and in their complexity. But could you give us a brief introductory definition of what structural racism is?
Absolutely. So there's basically two ways of answering the question. And my book does both. But the first way to understand it is as an evolution of a series of insights. And, in a traditional formation and still in a prevailing way, the main way of understanding racism and racial inequality is interpersonally, that is between people. And in this mode, there's essentially a person who is a bigot. Either they're prejudiced, or if they're not prejudiced, they have racial antipathy or racial anxiety or racial stereotypes that they hold, and they act on those. So perhaps an employer has a racial stereotype and refuses to hire someone because of their race or promote them because of their race. Right? That's sort of the traditional mode, and that mode informs how we understand discrimination to occur. Right? And many people just think that racial inequality is just the sum of those discriminatory events writ large. In the 1960s, Charles Hamilton and Stokely Carmichael came upon the notion of institutional racism, which was really an evolutionary leap. And it basically said, look, you don't actually need a perpetrator. You don't need a racist actor. What you can have is institutions, corporations, governments, universities that can have neutral rules, facially neutral rules, even non-discriminatory rules that operate because of background conditions to disadvantage members of certain racial groups. So you can think about how structures disadvantage people, right? Like people with disabilities are disadvantaged by stairs. So there's all sorts of structures that are disadvantaged. Stadium restrooms disadvantage women. So there's all sorts of ways that in their ordinary operation, structures and systems and rules can disadvantage people depending on their characteristics and needs. And institutional racism was this insight that even facially neutral rules could disadvantage members of racial groups. Now, it was never fully worked out whether those rules, even though they were superficially neutral and fair, were designed of nefarious intent or whether there was no ill will or antipathy behind them. And that was an ongoing debate. And this debate moved forward and forward, and there's different scholars and researchers who added to this debate, but a critical one is Dr. Kamara Jones, who in the 90s published a brief but powerful essay called The Gardener's Tale. And she has a YouTube video that we can link to that's phenomenal as well. But several of her insights, along with Iris Marion Young, articulated what we now call a structural approach or insight. And what Dr. Jones recognized was that harms could occur not simply from commission, but from omission, from inaction, from failure to water the plant, right? Like the gardener, from failure to give it healthy soil, for failure to give it sunlight and nutrients, could be just as harmful. And this is a kind of indifference or callous indifference that can contribute to racial inequality. That's not an act of commission or even antipathy. It's a kind of failure to care. And fast forward, work on complex systems theory helped us understand how systems operate, and that the organization of a system, where nodes are, the connections between those nodes, can actually produce what Donella Meadows calls emergent properties, or what Tricia Rose calls meta effects. So you don't actually need an intent, just the operation of the system can produce harm. And so that's systemic, and structural goes beyond that. So structural racism is essentially a recognition in the largest sense possible that the interaction and operation of systems, absent antipathy, absent prejudice, absent discriminatory intent, can both produce and maintain and perpetuate racial inequality. That's the first way of understanding it. And I have that featured in chapter 4 of my book. But I think the other way that's easier to enter into, and the way that I sort of lean into even more, is that there are these structures of opportunity, what we call local opportunity structures, that depending on your location within them and your proximity to the critical nodes within that structure, either facilitate upward mobility, they put you on the up escalator, or they inhibit you and constrain you from accessing vitalizing resources, good schools, healthy environments, safe playgrounds and parks, right? These kinds of investments that help people thrive. And so the way that I try and answer that question, what is structural racism, is basically, it is the racialization of opportunity structures. It is the way in which racial advantage and disadvantage affects different racial groups through these local opportunity structures. And so in chapter 1, what I do is I identify the layers of the opportunity structure that are most important today and the forces that operate across the opportunity structure. And the opportunity structure in chapter 1, I don't even focus on race. I talk about how it works in terms of class, geography, and generations. And then in chapter 2, I show how it applies to race once we've sort of sharpened that structural perceptiveness. So the basic answer that I offer is that there are opportunity structures that produce advantage and disadvantage systematically based upon where people live and are situated proximately within those structures.
Good. That wasn't exactly brief, but you did cover most of the questions I wanted to ask you with regards to thinking about structural racism. But before we go on further, I'd like to bring in John Powell. John, as you know, is the director of the Othering and Belonging Institute, and he wears many hats. He's also a professor of law, African American studies, and ethnic studies here at UC Berkeley, as well as being the Haas chair of equity and inclusion. And for part of this discussion too, this was kind of the last in a series of questions I wanted to ask you, Stephen, but I'd like to bring in John's perspective on this too. Why is it important for us to have a structural understanding of racism, particularly at this historical moment? John, you want to speak to that?
Sure. So, Michael, it's always good to be in your company, virtually or otherwise. Actually, in some ways, I prefer the otherwise. To be in your physical company. Stephen, good to see you, and congratulations. This is a really powerful book. So it's important to understand, first of all, Stephen sort of intimated this, but I'll make it explicit. Structures are not neutral. They're doing work. We actually, and they're complex. There are many actors. There's not one person or even one group necessarily in control of structures. Maybe no one's in control completely, although we're responding and acting to them. And so when we see the sort of what Tilly calls durable inequality, we see the durable disparities in our society. And we don't just have these disparities, we also have stories about them. You know, why are Blacks, Latinos, and other groups not doing as well as some of them? So we have a story now that's coming out, which is part of what's called the Dark Enlightenment, which basically says, you know, it's Charles Murray all over again, right? That these groups are just not cutting it. It's a culture of poverty. Maybe it's IQ, maybe it's manifest destiny. But in some ways, if you can't find an explicit nefarious actor to produce racialized outcomes, and those outcomes persist, the story is they're just there, they're natural. And not only should we not do anything to do something, would actually be a violation of being neutral. That's basically the Trump administration's position. And so the attacks on critical race theory, DEI, the attacks on even racial history. It's like, so, and it has an intuitive appeal, in part because Tilly says, you know, we're methodological individualists. When we see something, we want to explain it in terms of individual behavior. And that leaves us wanting. It actually misses the mark. And so, and I think Stephen says in the book, even people who are quote unquote racial justice activists, they end up being methodological individualists, which actually, so in our society, there's been this long misunderstanding of colorblindness. The work around the mind science and implicit bias shows the mind in a society like ours, where race is so critical to everything, not just to Black people or people of color, or it structures our understanding of society and our institutions. So when we said, let's be colorblind, let's not look at color, it has an intuitive appeal, but we can't be colorblind. What we are, though, is structurally blind. We don't see the work the structures are doing. And again, when we see this big spider web, we immediately says, where's the spider? And someone says, there's no spider. Then there's no spider web. So if we're going to correct this, I think we have to be clear about it. And it's interesting to me, race is almost never in that quote unquote neutral spot. You know, so you get something after George Floyd, did you mention, Michael? So let's do something. But what is it that we do? We spend a lot of time in terms of like training to get rid of racial bias, but very little in terms of understanding the racial structure and dynamic that's producing these disparities. And when we make even the smallest intervention, we get racial resentment. Why are you doing that for those groups? So we're in this really hard place in our society. And this actually potentially not only gives us an intervention for doing something that really might work. But it also gives an understanding of a language that can break that sort of impasse that we've tended to have in discussing race.
Just to add to that, I think it's so important to recognize that despite the attention, despite the media coverage, despite the largest protests in American history, what was accomplished? What is endured from that accomplishment fundamentally in terms of policy change, in terms of reduction of disparities, in terms of outcomes? Many of the policy reforms that were adopted have now been rolled back. Bail reform has been rolled back in Minneapolis and elsewhere. Decriminalization measures have been recriminalized, rolled back. Even California has sort of more punitively increased sentencing, even last November through a ballot initiative. And more than that, I think to what John was saying, the attention is too often on symptoms, on epiphenomena, and the energy is spent. Okay, let's, I think most notoriously was the San Francisco Unified School District School Board renaming buildings, rather than figuring out what are the fiscal and structural conditions, environmental conditions that are shaping disparities. There's a focus on epiphenomenon. If we put 80% of our energy or even 40% of our energy in looking for the spider, if the web is not built by a spider, then we're misallocating our attention and effort. And I think a structural analysis is an attempt to refocus our attention to those conditions and structures. It's an attempt to sharpen our perceptiveness and perspicacity of structures and structural arrangements, rather than slipping back into these conventional modes of thinking and talking.
Stephen, you provide a lot of interesting illustrative examples of structural racism. I wondered if you might talk about that just briefly in order to allow us to understand that. For example, one of the core themes of your book is your focus on the structure of opportunity in the United States across varied domains. And you talk about how opportunity is racialized. What's an example of how opportunity is racialized?
Well, the most easy way to understand this is that if you look at studies that examine the dynamics of upward mobility, socioeconomic transition between generations, you see huge disparities. So even when there are not disparities in terms of income, for example, you can look at upper income Black families and look to see what percentage of the children in those families stay as adults as upper income or fall somewhere below. And it's shocking, right? It's not only, there's this sort of sense that Black families are mobile and white families Black families are immobile, right? That Black children are stuck in poverty, to use Patrick Sharkey's phrase, stuck in place. And white families are upwardly mobile. But when you actually look at the dynamics of opportunity, you actually see a mirror that Black children are mobile. They are just downwardly mobile. And white children are mobile. Poor white children are upwardly mobile, and affluent Black children are downwardly mobile. And it happens at every quintile in the income distribution. So the most obvious way is just to look at outcomes. But really what I'm trying to do is unpack why those outcomes exist. What are the structures that facilitate upward and downward mobility by race? And so when you look at that, what you're really looking at is the provision of public goods, capacity, fiscal incapacity, and the emblematic places and municipal fragmentation. And the emblematic places of this are places like Ferguson, Missouri, Flint, Michigan, places where you have high rates of concentrated poverty, you have underperforming schools, and you have a fiscal system that essentially preys on the local populace while providing inadequate public services and public goods, right next to thriving communities that are predominantly white. And so fiscal distress, underperforming schools, poor exposure to health contaminants, lead in the water is just the most extreme example, but PM 2.5s, runoff, asthma-inducing contaminants, lack of tree cover, heat. All of these things are racially related, and you can see it clearly in the data. So those are some brief examples.
John, Stephen emphasizes too, as he talked about just now, that place matters. Place matters with respect to opportunity. But there's a whole nest of different kinds of ways people are spatially organized. I mean, there's the role of regions, of municipalities, of even neighborhoods in some ways, How do you reflect on the fact about place and place matters?
Well, as Stephen made reference to, or Sharkey made reference to, stuck in place, that part of what we do, we know about segregation on some level, but I prefer to talk about two things: segregation of opportunity, that how we distribute opportunity across geographic codes. One of the points I think that Stephen is making is this can't be explained just in terms of personal animus. It's too much, it's too big. And so we have a mechanism that sorts us in a certain way. The mechanism is doing the work. We don't have to think about it. We don't have to think about how to get from point A to point B. There's streets that are set out. We just follow the streets. And they're profoundly racialized and other, gendered as well. Stephen gave the example of stairs. The physical structure of stairs creates an impediment if that's the only way to get from one floor to the other for someone in a wheelchair. So the structure matters. The structure is doing work. Now, does the person who designed the stairs have animus toward people in a wheelchair? Maybe, but probably not. And so you keep multiplying those. And that's why I say it's important to realize that structures are doing work. We design schools not to be neutral. We design schools to educate. But we design them with both in terms of impact and sometimes intent for particular people, right? So Stephen also mentioned, I think this is a quote we'll come to later, about the opposite of, love is not hate, but indifference. And I think that's close. I think it's more pernicious than that, though. There was a recent New York Times piece going at great length, which I think makes sense, about how we need something for boys. Stephen sent this to me. Boys are falling behind. There was no discussion about boys being inferior. There's no discussion about boys just being lazy. There's no discussion about boys being deadbeats. It's basically saying we care about boys, we got to fix this problem. Now, so there's also, Michael, in terms of being stuck in a story. And the story is that if marginalized groups are not doing well, there's a story. There's an explanation. It's not structural. It's personal. It's behavioral. So again, so there's something there that, but if Black boys are not doing well or Blacks are not doing well, there's a different story. So the combination, the structures matter a lot, but also we think about the stories of how we make the sense making of this durable inequality. That's important as well. And the final thing I say is that if you have a story that Black boys are not doing well or Blacks are not doing well because they're whatever, then when you do an intervention, it's seen as inappropriate. You're supposed to be neutral. Mm-hmm. Why are you putting an elevator in? Putting an elevator in because some people can't get to the third floor using the stairs. So what structures call our attention to is when you have these durable inequalities, how do we make sense of them? How do we address them? And while personal antipathy may be present in some sense, it's not nearly enough in terms of the intervention. And after George Floyd, I would say a lot of work. I don't think it's irrelevant, although I think sometimes it was done a way that didn't work. But there was little attention to the structures, more attention to the spider. The last thing I said on this, so who's the spider in this story? the spider is the racist, the spider is the bad person, the spider is. So then you also have this thing that no one wants to be the spider. No one wants to be the racist. No one wants to be responsible for the durable inequalities. So let's put it back on the group that's actually, let's put it back on George Floyd, which is what we see the right is even doing now as they try to rewrite the story. It's his fault that he was killed. The poor policeman, wow, what could he do?
This is interesting about, John, about the stories we tell, the kinds of explanations we evoke to explain disparities, situations of very, extreme inequality. I'm wondering, what is the role of, say, racial ideology in all this? We talk about racial structures. How do racial ideologies come into play? And are structures and ideology reciprocal, mutually reinforcing, or how might we understand that dynamic in the case of the ways we construct those stories, and indeed their implications later for policies as well?
So that's a big topic, Michael. And I would say two things. I would say for the listener, the reader, the people who care about this, Stephen's book, I think, adds a really important element. But there are you bring in another element. And what we actually talk about somewhat in the book that Stephen has on his desk, Belonging Without Othering, is there's a racial formation. Oh, wait a minute. Michael wrote that book, Racial Formation. No, I'm just sort of joking, but I'm serious. That we're actually looking at something very complex. We're looking at not just the structure and the making of physical space. We're looking at the structure and making of identity. We're looking at both issue about knowledge. How do we know things? A issue about physicality. What do we do? But it's also an issue about being. Who are we? And one of the, from my perspective, one of the limitations of trying to address racism in America, especially as it relates to, whites and non-whites or whites and blacks, is that we're actually remaking people. We're remaking identity. And that's part of the role of those stories. So that's a complicated topic. I don't want to go too far into it, but I, in all seriousness, would recommend to the listener to read not only Stephen's new book, Structural Racism, but also Belonging Without Othering, and Michael and Howard's book on racial formation.
Stephen? Yeah.
Seconded. No, I think there's a complex relationship, but the simple way to understand it is that racist ideas do not precede racist structures. Rather, they're an emanation of racist structures, a defense of them. So I'll give you a couple of examples. Richard Reeves has written a book called Dream Hoarders. It's really about class, not about race, but the analysis is directly applicable. And what he basically argues is that the top 20%, rather than 1% of Americans, have essentially organized opportunity structures across all of our metropolitan areas in a way that systematically advantages them or that they use to their advantage. So, and he says that sort of high opportunity places have become greenhouse, upper income families have become greenhouses for nurturing their youth. So when families decide what neighborhoods they're going to move into, how they're going to finance schools, how they're going to fund PTAs and supplement school provision, people are making mostly self-interested decisions. I want to put my kid in the best school. I want them to get the best education. I'm looking not just for a home, I'm looking for an investment. I'm looking not just for an investment, I'm looking for a good investment. I don't just want my property values to go up. I want to maximize my property money, where we invest our money, our retirement vehicles. They all contribute to and perpetuate racial inequality. Dorothy Brown has written a phenomenal book, The Whiteness of Wealth, which I cite in my book, talking about how the tax code works this way. So it's not, again, as John said, there is animus out there. There is antipathy out there. But a lot of these structural arrangements are not driven by animus or antipathy. In fact, they are driven by self-interest and greed and opportunism. And the pursuit of that systematically and collectively has the meta effect of maintaining and perpetuating racial inequality because of a set of background starting conditions and initial conditions. ask yourself, who wrote the tax code? Who's behind the tax code? There's no one person. It's literally generations of legislators in a decentralized way, sprawling, right? From Republic.
You froze a bit there, Stephen.
Oh, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
There's no person who has written the tax code, and yet, who benefits from the tax code? The well-connected, the people who can hire accountants to take advantage of it, affluent businesses who can find tax havens overseas, corporation, right? So it's a structure that exists that's seemingly, supposedly, by design, seemingly neutral, although we know it's not, has effects that can be taken advantage of. And contemporary opportunity structures are essentially the same thing by race.
Stephen, you enter into certainly something which has been a kind of ongoing and contentious kind of debate about the relative merits of race versus class. And it shapes not only, I think, the analysis people bring to understanding race and racism in the United States, but also to the kinds of policy options which emanate from that, what kinds of things we should do. How do you understand the relationship of race versus class, or race and class in the United States?
Yeah, it's a wonderful question. And a lot of the sort of progressive wisdom among policy heads is, let's just focus on class. Let's just do a class agenda. And the sweet spot is a class-based agenda that can reduce racial disparities, but without necessarily naming it, right? I think that's largely wrong for a lot of reasons. John has written a phenomenal article called The Race-Class Nexus, so I'll let John talk about this in a moment. But logically, right, or fundamentally, if race is just reducible to class, then you wouldn't need a race lens to understand racial inequality. You would just look at class. And I argue in chapter 2 of the book, that's not possible. And in particular, 3 expressions of class that are so racialized that if you had a colorblind lens, you couldn't even see them. One is durable poverty. The second is concentrated poverty. And the third is childhood poverty. One of the graphs in my book shows the enormous disparity between Black and white childhood poverty. It's like 40% to 10% roughly, over the last 50 years. It's just such a huge difference. If you were just to look at childhood poverty in a race-blind lens, you would miss that. And the gulf is even larger when it comes to concentrated poverty. Basically, the experience of concentrated poverty, meaning living in a neighborhood where 40% of your neighbors or more earn below the federal poverty line, is essentially doesn't exist for white families, even poor white families who live in places, with the rare exception of certain places like Appalachia. But basically 2/3 of neighborhoods of concentrated poverty in the country are Black or Latino. And the more you dig into it in the way that I do in chapter 2, you see even more how it's a non-white experience. Basically, low-income white people live in middle-income neighborhoods. Middle-income Black Americans are more likely to live in low-opportunity, high-poverty neighborhoods. And then durable poverty, which is poverty over 10 years, is essentially not experienced by white Americans. It's very, very rare. So these forms of poverty, and some might say, well, aren't they still class? A, you wouldn't be able to see them if you didn't have a race lens. And B, there is actually an independent race factor, which is racial residential segregation, that compounds and concentrates poverty. And if you're just looking at class, you'll be completely blind to that reality. So you can't use race and class. I like Prudence Carter's phrase. They're fraternal twins. They share a common DNA, but they operate with distinctive racial elements, and therefore race is not reducible to class.
John, you want to speak more about the race-class nexus?
Yes, I've said in some context that the only thing we probably understand less well than race in the United States is class. We actually don't know what we're talking about when we say class. What many people mean is socioeconomic, but that's not. That's not class in any rigorous sense. It's not class in the way that Europeans think about class. There's, for the most part, not a class identity. most Americans, from those who make $5,000 a year to those who make $500,000 a year, call themselves middle class. So there's, and the phenomenon is also quite different. Gunther Myrdal wrote a book in the 1940s with help with others called The American Dilemma. And in the book, he made it clear that white poverty and black poverty was actually two different things. Now think about 1940. If you're white in much of America, no matter how poor you are, you could vote. If you're in the South and you're black, even if you were not poor, in most parts of the South, you could not vote. So you were not, so your group was bleeded out of participating in decisions. And we talk a lot about concentrated poverty, understandably, but it's also concentrated wealth. How does that concentrated wealth get organized? And even sort of understanding big problem now in terms of immigration, right? The United States never corrected adequately its early admonition that you had to be white to be naturalized as a U.S. citizen, without defining what white is. So there's a complicated interaction. And really what people are trying to do is avoid a discussion of race, because race has been so contentious. But to sort of then put it on class actually is a way of actually just obfuscating. It's not a real discussion at all. And there's a relationship between them, but as Stephen said, it's a complicated relationship. It's not straightforward. And one of the obvious things is when people say, when you talk about race, it's divisive. The obvious question is why? Why is this so divisive? You know, I mean, I think they would say in Russia, in England, in France, class is divisive. So anyway, it's a way oftentimes there's some overlap. There's, you know, blacks or people of color are disproportionately poor, and yet most interventions based on socioeconomic doesn't solve the structural problem that Stephen's talking about.
Stephen?
Yeah, I agree with that. I think if you just do class-based interventions, you can make some headway in reducing racial disparities, but you could also widen racial disparities. There's ample examples from the New Deal and elsewhere that if you make an intervention that is insensitive to structural arrangements, you can actually make those racial disparities worse. So a kind of broad-based class intervention could help, but it could also exacerbate racial inequality if it is insensitive to structural arrangements. And yeah,
Michael, another thing, it's in order for people, we talk about this in our book, Belonging, people need to have the right to participate. People need to have their stories told. And part of the class effort is actually to silence certain stories. Like, we actually don't want to hear about race. It's like saying we don't want to hear about your disabilities. We don't want to hear who's the we? Who gets to decide that the story of loss of land for Native Americans, immigration for and internment for Japanese Americans, slavery for blacks doesn't get to be told. That story doesn't get to be told. That's an injury in and of itself. We don't hear a story because it's not a good story. You know, when I talked about taking a Native American land, taught that at University of Minnesota, one of my white students raised his hand and said, "Professor Powell, why are we studying about Native Americans? This is supposed to be an American history class." I said, "This is American history. This is our history. You know nothing about Native Americans. You don't know what kind of food they ate. You don't know what kind of social structure they had. All you know is that we took their land. That's our story." So there's some subtleties in this as well. You know, I mean, anyway, and especially in this environment is not a neutral environment. This is a hostile environment. This is an environment that's perpetrating not just structural arrangements, as it takes away money and resources and attack the idea of disparate outcomes, but it also is trying to tell a story about Americans that erase people who are not white and Christian.
Yeah, that's such an important point. which is that it's not just that this issue is so important. It's that we now have a federal government that is not simply on the sidelines here, but is actively hostile, not just to policies that can remedy these problems, but to even discussion of it, and has banned literally the terms systemic racism and racism. So the moment that we are in is potentially more important than ever to be having this conversation.
And for people who are listening on YouTube, and go buy this book, because it will soon be banned.
Well, John makes a good point there about the ways in which our understanding of history and memory is being sort of pulled out from us too, as changes are being made to curriculum reforms about what kinds of monuments could be, in the National Park Service, and explanations for different things. Revoking certain kinds of, reinstating some of the names of camps that were formerly, the military facilities that were formerly, named after Confederate generals, to, in fact, the recent thing, given Pride Week, about the naval ship Harvey Milk being renamed as part of this kind of real sort of an assault on our kind of common public history and memory. But let me extend part of this race class thing in a different direction, because I'd like us to move towards what is a structural racist approach. What does taking a structural lens to racial inequality in the United States mean for policies? Stephen, you're quite right about the dramatic upsurge we saw, mobilization 5 years ago around George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter movement didn't result in any sort of permanent reforms, or there were reforms and now they're being sort of reneged upon. One thing that comes out of the race class debate is whether or not we need policies that are much more targeted versus kind of universalistic kinds of reforms in order to deal with questions of disparities with respect to opportunity in the United States. How does a structural lens help us understand some of the things between a target approach, say affirmative action, versus some sort of more broader reform that might result in lessening disparities among all Americans?
Yeah, this is a very important and difficult question to answer. I spent the bulk of chapter 4 sort of trying to distill the key principles that would inform a structural agenda, a reform agenda, and an agenda that can dismantle structural racism. And I principally talk about 3 policies: affirmative action, reparations, and disparate impact. I'm not going to recap that here. Instead, I'm going to try and just talk about the principles. So in one respect, I take a sort of extremist view here. And this is what I'm extreme on. I think that we have to get away from the idea of good intentions when it comes to policy. This is one of the few things that I will actually agree with Milton Friedman on. You should not judge a policy by its intent, but by its outcomes. I think he's right about that. And so one of the things I think we get tripped up on is we're looking for someone who is empathetic as a policymaker. We're looking for someone who appears to understand the issue. And what I say is, I would rather have a bigot, an interpersonal racist, whose public policy position or jurisprudence is egalitarian, rather than someone who is interpersonally empathetic and yet supports policies whose effects are to perpetuate structural racism. And sort of the paradigmatic example of this, many will remember, is during Katrina, Kanye West asked, "Is George W. Bush racist?" And part of the reason for that is there seemed to be just such a callous indifference and the slow response to the recovery, the lack of preparation for the hurricane, that people asked that. And then the pundit class looked at it and said, "No, we don't think George W. Bush is a racist," as if that actually is what mattered. It's not. And so what we have around this country is too many mayors, too many city council members, too many governors who serve a kind of white suburbanate constituency, right, that reinforce structural racial inequality. And many of these people, including many people in progressive places like Marin in San Francisco, they reinforce policies that are structurally racist, right? Even though they may be. So that's the thing I'm extreme on. I think we've got to get away from looking into people's hearts and really focusing on what is the impact of these policies? And I say, actually, we should be more critical of policies that are ineffective or counterproductive than those that are nefarious. Because a nefarious policy, we at least know that there's a bigot behind it. You know, when the Muslim travel ban was put in place, or the border walls proposed, or these, mass deportations, we can at least see the bigotry. It's clear what the animus is behind it. When Stephen Miller calls, all these immigrants, these ordinary, hardworking people, criminals and insurrectionists, we can see the bigotry. But if someone rather does something, policy, but it's totally ineffective, or even worse, counterproductive and stokes backlash, we should be more critical of that, because it means that people will become apathetic. Well, like, we tried that and it didn't work. So my view is the different structural lens gives us a completely different view of what to valorize and what to oppose. And my example of this is the first Justice Harlan, who is possibly the most progressive American Supreme Court justice, even more than Thurgood Marshall in his jurisprudence. And yet, in his writings, sort of admitted to being a white supremacist, yet again has a more expansive constitutional vision we can even fathom today. I mean, John can talk more about that. So I'll stop there, but that's I think a big part of where we need to go.
John, how about this thing about thinking about structural racism and policies such as entering into debates about targeted versus universal?
Sure. Well, again, that's an important discussion, and I would just say a couple of things. Michael, as you know, and Stephen's been a part of this, we have something we call targeted universalism. We say that the goal should be universal. The strategy should be targeted based on how people are situated. But the goals are universal, and it's for everybody. But people, groups, are situated differently. And so you make different interventions, not because of their race per se, not because of their gender per se, but because their race and gender situates them differently within our society. But Stephen and I both talk about plus some strategies, saying, how do we do something for everybody? How do we acknowledge everybody and everybody's pain? And so the particularistic targeted strategy sometimes says we only care about a particular group, and it can pit groups against each other. Universal says, we don't see groups. We're blind to group situation. And both of those are problematic. Instead, we should say, we want every child to be healthy and to go to bed well fed. That's the universal goal. What that means for Black children, for Native American children, for recent immigrants, for white children living in the middle class, living in the suburb, may be quite different. The intervention might be quite different. But we're saying the goal is to have every child healthy and every child well fed. And the strategy has to be targeted based on how groups are actually performing, where they are, and what would work for them. Coronavirus is a great example. We want everyone to be safe from the virus. What does that mean? Well, if you're a Native American living on a reservation and they say, wash your hands 20 times a day, I don't have running water. If they say, stay away 6 feet from people who are strangers, who are not part of your family, and you're a migrant worker living in a bunk, not possible. If they say, see a healthcare professional if you have any problems, and if you're living in inner city Detroit and there are no functioning clinics, can't do it. So the other thing I want to just point out is that when we did TANF, we actually made the racial disparity between white women and Black women worse. And most of the stuff was space neutral. So you had to go to work within 2 years, and some extension you could be extended to 5 years. Two quick things. The 2 and 5 years was actually tracking the experience of most white women. Most white women who got on welfare were off in 2 years and certainly off by 5. It was not tracking the experience of Black women who oftentimes had intergenerational experience of welfare and poverty. But aside from that, it said you had to go to work. It turns out that Black women have the least access to public transportation. They don't have cars, and they don't have access to public transportation. White women, poor like Black women, children like Black women, but they live places where there was a functioning public transportation system. And they could get to jobs. So if you just looked at the women in terms of their socioeconomic, they were the same. But they were situated very differently within structures. If you wanted Black women to be able to get to the jobs, you needed a different intervention than you needed for white women. So targeted universalism tries to address that and tries to address it in some for everybody, not just for the most marginal, but for everybody.
Michael, part of it, I totally agree with what John just said, but part of it is to break out of the frame of zero sum. And so targeted policies are just too easily viewed as what John has called a special pleader or special interest on behalf of a particular group. And then potentially that breeds resentment, and it's really easy fodder for backlash. So if you appear to be helping one group, a good example of this was in 2021, the Biden administration issued a policy to help Black farmers who had been systematically discriminated against. And immediately that out of a fund, a federal fund, that policy was immediately enjoined in federal court, right? And then everyone was unhappy. The Black farmers felt like they were getting screwed over. The white farmers felt like they were being, so what you need are generally more positive sum policies, or even more importantly, to frame these policies as positive sum, because very few policies are actually zero sum, but targeted policies are much more easily labeled as such. One other thing. So it's not just whether you should choose targeted or universal policies. I think the more important question is the policy structurally sensitive or structurally targeted? So I've got a wonderful book that John and I both thought was really strong by Joseph Fishkin called Bottlenecks, a new theory of equal opportunity. And one of the things that he does really well, if you think of like getting into higher education as a bottleneck, right? You take a test, you graduate from high school, and you're trying to get into, let's say, a highly ranked or selective university. That's a bottleneck. How do you address a bottleneck? Well, one way to do it is you widen the bottleneck so more people can flow through, right? The problem with that is if you just widen the bottleneck, you actually create more competition for a scarce resource. So if only 1,500 people can get into Harvard, and let's say remove the discrimination against Jewish people to Harvard, and like they didn't, have in the 20s, you have more people competing for fewer slots. So it actually feels zero sum. It's not positive sum. Affirmative action is metaphorically a workaround the bottleneck. So the bottleneck is still constraining. It's still holding people from getting through the bottleneck. But affirmative action is saying we're going to do this special thing around it. And the Texas 10% plan Texas 10% plan is actually an example of transforming the structure in a sense. It's saying, we're going to have a completely different approach to admissions here. Although you could go even deeper and do a more transformative approach. I think the key is, number one, you want it to be positive sum, and you want a structural intervention. Not one that targets people tends not to be structural. But if you target structures, you will not only serve people, but you'll serve people outside of the target group. It'll benefit more people than just those you're aiming at. So a structural intervention is preferred over targeting people.
Stephen, you should explain the Texas 10% plan with respect to high schools and about what it was.
So in the 1990s, at the University of Texas, which is Texas's flagship university, there was an affirmative action program that used explicit consideration of race in higher education because of the really extreme disadvantage in Black and Latino neighborhoods and high schools and primary and secondary schools that continues to this day. But the Fifth Circuit struck down the University of Texas's affirmative action plan in Hopwood. And so in a remarkable turn, policy development, the state legislature not the university, the state legislature adopted a policy called the Texas 10% Plan that automatically qualified all graduating seniors that graduated in the top 10% of their public high school class to the University of Texas. Now, it's since been modified a bit because there was such overwhelming. The university found that it ended up being about 80% of the undergraduate class, so they capped it at 75%. So now if you're a junior in Texas, you get a letter that will tell you what percentage you have to fall in. It's usually about 8.5% now to get into UT Austin. And remarkably, this policy passed the legislature, as described in Lonnie Guinier's book, The Minor Canary, because by just a few votes, I think maybe even one vote, but it passed because of a lot of white rural legislators recognized that in their districts, no one attended UT Austin. No one got in. So you had this alliance of sort of Black and Latino districts with white rural legislators sort of allied against the more affluent white suburbanites. That's an example of a positive sum policy, right? It benefits everyone. It serves everyone based in a positive way. It can't easily be viewed as a special pleader or fodder for demagogic backlash. I've been instructed, by the way, that if you have questions, drop them in the chat box. We'll get to them very soon.
So, Stephen, just to add, so one reason this quote unquote works is because schools are segregated.
Yeah.
And so you have essentially all Black schools and all Latino schools and all white schools. And so if you had and there's some game in the system where white families would take their kids out of white schools and put them in a Black or Latino school so they could be in that top 10%. But
which might be a good thing. But.
Yeah, it might be a good thing. But it also shows how systems are complicated, and you make a move and the system makes a move. Other people make a move. But also, we've been working on it. We haven't got it across the finish line. We have a whole thing on target universalism that I would recommend to the listener.
Thanks. Stephen, you describe in your book about 10 types of initiatives we might embrace in order to deal with this kind of the issue around structural racism. Can you just briefly give us one example of what that is? Anyone you want to choose from, but
well, I'll choose the first. So we didn't really get to talk much about this, Michael, but one of the strong claims in my book is that contemporary structural racism, which is, and I'll ask Michael to I'll ask Mark to put the indifference quote up. So structural racial inequality, part of what we denote as racism is the indifference to it. So the quote by Elie Wiesel is that the opposite of hate is not love, it's indifference. And part of it is just extremely callous indifference, right? This is a wonderful quote. The opposite of art is not ugliness, it's indifference. The opposite of faith is not heresy, it's indifference. The opposite of life is not death, it's indifference. And this indifference is part of what is so enraging, right? The indifference to Katrina, the indifference during the uprisings, during the Kerner Commission survey, that people were just furious at the lack of care, the lack of regard. One of the things that I think is really central, Michael, is a lot of these expressions of contemporary racial inequality are not legacies of the past. They're contemporary developments. They're disinvestment, divestment during the Reagan administration. They're the war on drugs and mass incarceration during the 1980s and 1990s. They are the subprime mortgage crisis, fiscal distress. So the one policy I'll foreground is fiscal regionalism. We have to get away from this fragmentation of our regions where everyone is parochial and you have this localism and defensive parochialism. And the kind of leading example of this is the Twin Cities tax sharing policy, where in the 1970s, the Twin Cities adopted this state policy that said that all future tax revenue would be evenly the growth in tax revenue, not existing revenue, but the growth in tax revenue would be divvied up equally by all the municipalities in the region. And a study done, 30 years later found that essentially you have a much more equitable region as a result of that. You have that 80% of the municipalities were winners, where you've had 20% winners in the past. So this fiscal regionalism helps make sure that everyone, John and I worked in Louisville, Kentucky, after the Supreme Court struck down their voluntary integration plan in 2007. One of the remarkable things about Louisville School District is it's a county-wide school district. It's called the Jefferson County School District. And we helped actually create the integration plan there. And you have county-wide district, which means that white parents who live in sort of the eastern parts of the county have to care about what's happening in western Jefferson County. So because it's not just divvied up their local school, it's that you care about the whole system. You care about the system as a whole. And what we have right now is a system where people live in metropolitan regions where they only care about their neighborhood or they only care about their city, and they're not solving the problems in their region. And part of that is because of this both municipal fragmentation, but also this fiscal distribution of resources.
Good, thank you. Before we move on to the questions from our audience, I want to ask you one last question, the both of you. I know it's a big question, but I'm hoping for some sort of like very pithy kind of soundbite with respect to this. What is the goal of racial justice, and how do you think about that question, and what is it?
Well, I don't want to steal John's thunder, but one of the goals that John will say is a world where everyone belongs, which I think is very important. I'll let him elaborate on that. I think one of the things that we get stuck on, so part of it is we can't just reduce disparities, because you could reduce disparities by bringing down the performance of the best performing group, right? We don't want to. So you could say, okay, we've got a 5-year life expectancy gap between Black and white Americans. You could theoretically eliminate that by bringing down white life expectancy, which in fact has happened in the last 10 years. And Angus Deaton and Ann Case have done their work on deaths of despair. It's been a huge problem. So to me, the answer has to be basically a world where where race does not affect your life chances, and where everyone can flourish and thrive and has a range of opportunities.
John.
Well, I would concur with what Stephen just suggested. No surprise there. I think Eric Ward said that Project of Black Americans is democracy. The racial justice really is about everyone. But it's not just, as Stephen said, it's not just saying everyone has the same thing. It's saying people have what they need to thrive, what they need to belong, what they need to participate. I wrote a piece saying that the most important right people have is the right of participation, because it's through participation that you make other things. Emeritus talks about capacities, that you have the capacity to live a good life and to fully participate. Now that may sound way sort of way far away from us right now, when we're sort of watching life being constrained, people being attacked, Earth being attacked. But we have to actually state these ideals and then move toward them. They become regulative ideals. The concept of equality, which was enshrined in our Constitution by Jefferson, who had 600 people enslaved. It's not just an act of hypocrisy. It's more complicated, more nuanced than that. And we're still fighting about what do we mean by equality. The UN Declaration of Human Rights, to sort of say this is something that everyone is entitled to. And I'll just end by just saying that. David French wrote a piece in the New York Times, and he talked about due process. And he says, due process, which is really saying everyone has a right to be heard. That's what due process, that's the heart of what due process is, that before we can deport you, before we can jail you, you have a right to be heard before an official court of law. What about if you're a criminal? Doesn't matter. What if you're an undocumented immigrant? Doesn't matter. What if you're a Nazi? Doesn't matter. What French makes the point is that it's universal. The dignity to be heard. Now, we don't live up to it. And we have an administration now trying to cut back, and a court that's actually playing with it. But the Constitution is clear in at least two different places that everyone is entitled to due process. So Stephen's right, it's like everyone belongs, everyone, no exception. Belonging has actually been part of our struggle for thousands of years. But we've always created belonging with othering. We've created belonging for some groups and then othering for others. So we have to move beyond that and have this ideal of belonging without othering. And that, to me, is sort of the heart of really racial justice.
Michael, before we go to the Q&A, I want to give you an opportunity to answer that question.
Ha! Turn it on me. That's a very good one. I certainly like the idea about the goal of racial justice as a sort of social order where race no longer does, shape to an inordinate degree one's life chances. I think that's extremely important. But I also share with John, and this is actually grafted on both of you, really, is to really consider how we, to consider the intense history of the kind of marginalization and othering of different groups. And what does it mean to have a kind of a vision, a different notion of humanity, in a sense, that sort of, can serve us in terms of both our outlook and our policy consequences in trying to create that social order in which race is no longer utilized to unfairly distribute resources and advantages, and actually permits people to sort of develop and according to, and lifts the barriers that we encounter right now by which race is utilized as a device to really shape and structure our life chances. So, yeah. We should take up the questions from you. And Mark, are you going to help facilitate us on this? All right. Thank you. We have a question which I think might appear on your screen as well. I'm not sure. How do you conceptualize your role in bridging the divide between institutional knowledge and public discourse, particularly among historically marginalized populations?
That's a perfect question for John.
So I'm eager to see how Michael answers it. So some of you may know on the viewers out there that I've written a book with help from my colleague Rochelle called The Power of Bridging. Bridging is basically the willingness and the assertion that every human being is deserving of dignity. Willingness to listen to each other's story, willingness to actually challenge the notion that there is an other. There are short bridges and there are long bridges. And so one of the things I oftentimes say to people, and people say, how do you convince people to bridge? And I say, I don't. You have to, after you sort of look into it, you have to decide yourself. And there may be certain conditions that are preconditions before you bridge. One of mine is when I go talk to people who have different views than me, maybe vote for different candidates, maybe live in different communities, no violence, no violence. And usually people agree, but sometimes people don't. And you asked specifically about marginalized populations. So bridging, I think, is actually a way in which not just humanizing, quote unquote, the other, but humanizing ourselves. Mm-hmm. Sometimes people want to give a pass for marginalized groups because marginalized groups are oftentimes discriminated against, sometimes traumatized, not ready to bridge. Fine. But be careful because there's a risk of further dehumanizing people by giving them a pass not to bridge. There's an injury, there's a vulnerability associated with bridging, but there's actually an injury associated with not bridging. So I know that's an inadequate answer, but I would say I'll add to the list of books we've already given you. The Power of Bridging I try to grapple with that in a little more detail.
Thanks, John. Let's see. What frameworks can be used to assess outcomes from a policy directive?
I think this is a really important question. We talked earlier, John brought it up, but I elaborated on the difference between zero sum and positive sum or plus sum policies, both in terms of framing and in terms of effects. What I forgot to mention was the excellent example of this by Angela Glover Blackwell called the curb cut effect.
Mm-hmm.
And her example of this is that the cutout on curbs was designed for people with disabilities and wheelchairs, but actually benefits everyone. So if you can identify a structural intervention like that is aimed at one population but has broader positive effects, that's really a litmus test, in my view, of an effective structural intervention. You want policies that affect multiple groups simultaneously. The other thing that I think is important to answering this is disparate impact. There's a whole controversy around this that was triggered in part by a proposal from Ibram Kendi around sort of like constitutionalizing this. And I think the criticism of his proposal was way overblown. Andrew Sullivan, for example, called it totalitarian, which I mentioned in my book. But really, if you think about how we do policy, we already look at disparate impacts. What do we think the environmental laws are? NEPA and CEQA. It's if you're going to do something, we just have to assess what the environmental effect is. When Congress is considering a bill, they have to take it to OMB and they have to get a budget effect estimate. Is this going to even on California ballot initiatives, there's a little line that says what the budget impact is going to be. I think it should be de rigueur. I think it should be a matter of course that whenever policymakers at the local level, the administrative level, the state level, or the federal level are considering a course of action, they should simply ask themselves, what is the effect of this on different populations, particularly racial populations? And if there is a disparate impact, it doesn't mean you can't do it. Just like disparate impact law doesn't mean you can't take that course. It just means you have to weigh the benefits and the harms and at least be aware of it. So in my view, a disparate impact analysis or frame or requirement sets the gaze of policymakers to avoid this problem of indifference, to avoid this problem of burying their head in the sand. That's all we have to do is just pay attention.
Good. Right. Someone asks that they're wondering how this discussion might incorporate the racializing effects of ongoing settler colonialism in the United States. Can you have racial justice without coming to terms with colonialism?
I guess I would say a couple of things. A lot of times there's an assumption of things being sequential, which I think is actually misses the way systems actually work. We get to sort of tell a story, and our story has to include our history. And also, as Stephen's book really suggests, that it's not just our history, it's what we're doing right now. In some ways, colonialism and racism were born at the same time and fueled each other. So again, it's almost like race and class. They're so close together. I mean, there are some exceptions, so Northern Ireland was colonized, but the major project, with England being the most extreme example of colonialization, was also profound racialization of the world. I think there are a lot of complicated questions. So, for example, think about the Texas 10% program. One could argue appropriately that you're making an intervention in a system that's otherwise deeply flawed. You're not changing the segregation of schools. You're not changing the distribution of money in schools. You're not changing the segregation of neighborhood. All that's true. But still, that program has had a profound effect that would not have been in place without it. So I think we're working on multiple fronts. We have to be willing to take advantage. And I say, sometimes we put too many preconditions before we will do the work. First we have to end capitalism, sexism, racism. We're not going to do the work then. If all those things are precursor to doing the work, we're not going to do it. It's not that those things don't matter. Again, so I see moving on multiple tracks and in ways which things are not just sequential, but things are dynamic. So they're affecting each other in ways that we can't fully anticipate.
And may require iterative and continuous monitoring and change to adjust to. So I've called myself an extremist in that one particular respect around really moving away from intent. And the correlate to that is really focused on outcomes, right? And so to me, it's where do you pour your energy? If you spend most of your energy trying to educate Americans about colonialism and historical racism, you can probably get a lot of awareness around that. But to what extent will that actually change contemporary structures that perpetuate and maintain racial inequality is an open question. If you have a limited number of, energy units you can allocate, my vote would be to put them into transforming contemporary structures. And again, focusing on things that actually change outcomes rather than epiphenomena, rather than focusing on naming and statues and things like that. It's not necessarily an either or, I realize that, but I think the goal the situation is so dire. The disadvantages are so deeply entrenched. We're ushering generation after generation into environments of concentrated poverty, permanent disadvantage, durable poverty. This simply cannot continue. And it's why we continue to have and will continue to have uprisings like we saw in 67 and 68 and 2020 and 2016. So I think this situation is too urgent to have, I don't mean to be glib about this, but to focus on historical seminars. I think what we have to do is transform contemporary arrangements now.
Let me just add two things very quickly. There's been a long debate about, do you change hearts and minds to change behavior, or do you change behavior to change hearts and minds? And there's research on both, depending on the situation. And I think what Stephen is inferring, and I want to pick it up anyway, is say you do both. Stories matter, symbols matter, sacred symbols matter a lot, but it doesn't do all the work. So stories are about meaning. What does something mean? We can't address racism, we can't address belonging without having a better story about meaning. So that may go into colonialism. But also there's a danger. I'll just name it. We don't want to spend too much time focusing on the spider, focusing on the races, focusing on, there's spiders out there. There are races out there. But what we do oftentimes when we actually focus on them, we don't focus with the kind of precision. Then the colonialists become everybody who's English. The races become everybody who's white. That's too broad. And not refined enough. So I think the challenge is to actually talk about colonialism, talk about racism, but realize it was really the elites who was driving this. People were complicit in some ways, but they weren't driving it. They weren't making laws. When the United States, or when the colonies were a colony here in the United States, the majority of people didn't vote. The majority of people couldn't vote when we became a country. Again, they may have participated, they may even benefited in some ways. But I think sometimes as we sort of think of these big ideas like colonialism and capitalism, who's the capitalist? I have money in my retirement. I don't think of myself really as a capitalist. I'm not Elon Musk, but I'm certainly affected by it. So I think there's some complexity that would be useful to draw into the picture. And to make sure that we're not sort of dismissing a whole range of people who are also in some ways both complicit but also being hurt by a structural system. Right.
I can't find that question that was originally asked about the relationship of racism and settler colonialism. I was thinking once that Angela Davis made this very interesting. Oh, thank you. Made this really interesting thing. She said that the sort of the Black demand for 20 acres and a mule had to ask the question, whose land was going to be taken for that? And what I think it speaks to is to be sensitive to, in fact, the kinds of patterns of particularly indigenous displacement and expropriation. But it gets to something about our vision of racial justice too, which is to really kind of acknowledge and understand in a kind of racialized hierarchy where different groups are often pitted against each other or are placed in different degrees of having access to resources and power and opportunity, that would be cognizant of the fact of the kinds of harms that at times racial groups can do to each other too.
Right.
And it's to realize those in specific situations as well, and understand that a vision of racial justice needs to, in fact, deal with the kinds of ways in which groups create harms for each other as well. Question, did the DEI and racial amnesty seminars lead to a distraction of structural racism and focused on individual racism and become more divisive than a unifying effort? Cites here White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo too.
So race is, like many concepts, race is incredibly complicated. I sometimes compare race to gravity. We all have weight. We all have the effects of gravity. And yet some scientists say there are probably less than 10 people in the whole planet that really understand gravity. It's really, if you dig into it, it becomes very complicated. I think Malcolm X said, race is like a Cadillac. There's a new version every year, so it's not one thing. James Baldwin said, there's no hope for us as long as they think they're white. So what race really means, certainly, and the obfuscation of race can't be put solidly at the foot of DEI. We've been obscuring what we mean by race. And if we were in a different place, we could have a serious discussion with some disagreements. I have a lot of respect for Robin DiAngelo, and yet I think the idea of white fragility is overstated. And it also, we have white fragility at the same time that we have Black trauma, right? So if a Black person is triggered in a meeting, we are invited to be empathetic, maybe rightly so, because of the trauma. But if a white person is triggered in a meeting, we're invited to excoriate them and call it white privilege. And I'm not saying there's not a such thing as white privilege, but if we're trying to sort of, as that great philosopher Bob Marley says, every person thinks his burden is the heaviest. So how do we actually bring in our different stories of suffering without giving any story privilege? So I think we could have a serious discussion about this, but everyone having a chance to participate. But it's hard to do this in the backdrop of the National Guard and Marines being on the streets rounding people up, telling schools that if you say, teach about Sojourner Truth, we're going to take your money away from you. Having the United States gratuitously decide that it's okay to go to war. So I think that we have a fraught environment. That's what I'm saying. And I think we have to be mindful of that. And I wouldn't approach things the same way as Robin does. But I would also want to be in discussion with her and at least acknowledge that she's trying to move things in the right direction.
So I also appreciate the question. I think that the concern I have with the approach of white fragility is that, again, it recenters the mind. It recenters ideation. It recenters intentionality, right? So the whole approach that she takes is to overcome white resistance to conversations about racism and racial remedy. And again, I think that recenters ideation instead of structures. And it weakens our structural perceptiveness and our structural perspicacity, which is really the muscle we have to strengthen. And I think, same thing. I thought Ibram Kendi's Stand from the Beginning was a marvelous book. But the subtitle is A History of Racist Ideas, right? Basically, it's ideation rather than structures. So what we have to get to, what I try and do here, is refocus attention on structural arrangements and how they maintain and perpetuate and cause racial inequality, and get away from this focus on ideas and ideation. Again, this does not mean that ideas don't undergird and the stories don't, and these ideas don't get into the stories that John talks about. But we are not going to solve these problems by simply overcoming white consciousness and resistance to it. We've got to get people focused to see how the structures work and then how we can reform or dismantle them so that everyone can do better.
Thank you. Should we take up one last question here, Mark?
Mark, if there's a new question, give it. Okay. Yeah, great.
Okay. Here we go. Maybe we'll take this on last since we're almost to our time. Structural racism discrimination is a global phenomenon. Are there examples of global structural othering and how the policy solutions you mentioned can apply to global issues? Question.
Samir asked that question, so we don't have to answer it. Stephen, do you want to?
Sure, I'll go first, and I'll let you close us out. So we do work at a global level, and we are concerned about global dynamics because these problems they're certainly not local. They're patterned across the United States, and they're patterned globally. The demagogy, the backlash, the gender dynamics, all of these things are global. This book is remarkably thin from what it originally was, because it was originally twice as long, but the editor and the publisher wisely insisted on brevity. And a lot of this is actually endnotes. But one of the things that I didn't have space to do is really talk about how did this analysis apply globally, just because of space limitations. But the truth is that the structure of opportunity, the capacities that are needed, the capabilities and capacities that people need in the United States are in many ways no different from that elsewhere. The investments in education and human capital, the healthy environment, all of these needs, transportation, access to good jobs, these are things that are shared globally. And the dynamics that occur in the United States, in a sense, what happened in Europe, if you look, for example, at France, in Paris, what happened in the banlieues, right, is essentially a precursor to what we've seen in the last 10 to 15 years in the United States. So the patterns are largely the same, and the groups might be different, but the dynamics are very similar. Mark, before we close, let's let John give a closing comment.
Well, again, thank you, Stephen. Thank you, Michael. Thank all of you for joining us. We begrudgingly do live in a global world now. We're being broadcast via some kind of computer platform. There are, I think, over 500 people on. Hopefully not all of them are from the United States. So we have these global mechanisms. We oftentimes are not feeling like we are the authors of them or they're in service of us. We need to change that. We can travel now. We do travel. We are in communication with people from all different parts of the world. We have a chance to actually rethink our global structures, to be participants in that. But to Stephen's point and to the point of this book, we have to think in global terms and structural terms. And we have to have better narration and better stories. The world, the times require that. We can't fix climate. We can't fix the environment. We can't even engage unless we recognize we're in a global world. That pandemic that we're still trying to forget was a global phenomenon. It didn't respect borders. And we banned all the planes and grounded everything, and it still moved around. So I think part of it is we have to actually create these structures. We have to tweak some of the ones that exist and create new ones. But at the heart of it has to be a deep respect, both in terms of everyone belonging, but also the effect they have on actual people and people's right to participate in them.
Thanks. On that note, we're going to conclude this session. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you, John. And congratulations, Stephen, on the publication of a very important book.
What an honor to be with you. Thank you all.